Africa as a continent holds a lot of minerals that could help in transitioning into green energy as well. What is your take on that?
Till now, we have been looking at a relationship which talked about cooperation between India and Africa in the hydrocarbon sphere. Now we are moving towards renewables.
Even China has shown a lot of interest.
Hospitals which the Chinese built, they were faulty, they developed cracks and terror groups which are attacking these countries.
So it's always win-win for China.
Yeah, it is a win-win for China.
There's a reason the subcontinent of Africa gets so much attention. It is because of its strategic geolocation and natural resources. It is crucial to understand how Africa perceives the rest of the world and India. That is why I bring to you an expert on African studies, Ruchita Beri, who is a consultant at IDSA and is seldom a part of various research groups on the subject of India-Africa relations. Having lived in various parts of Africa herself, we talk about India-Africa relations, different conflicts in Africa, and why there's so much interest looming from China and Europe. Through her latest book, India-Africa Relations, that talks about peace, security, and development. Stay tuned on an insightful conversation on the subject of India-Africa relations with Ruchita Beri. Before we start today's conversation, I've got one request. If you ever enjoyed the videos or found any value out of it, please subscribe to it. It really helps us as a channel to improve our content and bring better guests. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of the video. To begin with, I want to understand from you your interest in Africa and where did your connection with Africa come from?
I started looking at Africa or one of the countries in Africa, South Africa, with great interest in the mid-80s. That was the time when the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa was very strong, and it was the media used to really talk about that, and that's what got me interested in doing more research on Africa. But as you're well aware, Africa is not a monolith. There are 55 countries in Africa. So over the years, my interest in Africa has grown. It is not just limited to South Africa. I have worked and traveled to various countries in Africa.
Beautiful. So when we talk about Africa as a continent, we collectively put them in different countries, 55, 54 countries that, like you said, into one bracket. Is that the right approach?
Well, see, these are individual nations, 55 nations and all, as they are members of African Union. 54 countries are one with whom India has diplomatic relations. So these are countries which have diverse cultures, diverse economic performance, diverse political and cultural situations, but they are connected because that's the way the African countries are dealing with the situation themselves. They have the African Union, which was formed in 2002, but that is a new organization compared to the OAU, which was formed in the 60s. They look at themselves as a group, particularly when they are dealing with negotiations such as the climate change negotiations, or at the UNSC, or when you are discussing various issues related to UN. So increasingly, there is a narrative within Africa about integration. So when we look at Africa's external engagement with a number of countries across the world, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's US, whether it's any of the European countries like France or UK, you normally find that it is, say, India's engagement with Africa. That's the way they're doing it, because the African Union is the main negotiator or the main partner with whom the forum summits. That's the style of institutionalized engagement that is happening with Africa. So we call the relationship India and Africa rather than India and the 55 African countries. We do have very strong bilateral ties with a number of African countries. As you know, that it's only the Indian Ocean which divides India with Africa. So we've had very long historical relations, maritime relations with the African countries, especially on the east coast of Africa. So we have close relations with several of these countries. But I think politically, in terms of diplomatic relations, we do, tend to have this kind of policy of grouping them together.
Right. So, as you said, that there's a lot of interest from different countries in Africa, and even India has a lot of interest as well. We recently hosted G20, and we invited African countries for that discussion as well. How does Africa perceive India at the moment in a global stage?
Yeah, so I think India is one of the preferred partners of Africa, and it has been one of the refrain from the African countries that they are not really represented well in the multilateral organizations. India agrees with that, with the African countries on that there's nobody from Africa, none of the African countries are represented in the United Nations Security Council. So Africa does need to be represented in the UNSC. Similarly, the African countries also feel that India should also be part of the reformed UNSC, and that the reality as it exists today is skewed. It's high time that countries like India and some of the countries from Africa are part of the high table. The G20 is another organization or a forum which is representing both the countries from the north and from the global south. And India had this opportunity last year during its presidency of the G20 to work towards a more equal partnership between the north and the south. And so it pushed for greater representation from the global south, and it managed to get African Union as a full member of the G20. That's a big achievement, and that's something which the African countries are really very happy about, and really happy that India was able to pull this off in favor of African countries.
That's why India has been seen as the leader of the global south in a lot of aspects.
Yeah, so India is definitely pushing itself as a leader of global south, and which is something which the African countries are recognizing.
Nice.
So they find it good to do business with India.
I would also take this opportunity to congratulate you on your new book, The India-Africa Relations, that you recently edited. Do you want to tell us a little about the book, ma'am?
Yeah, so this book is called India-Africa Building Synergies in Peace, Security and Development. So both India and African countries feel that peace, security and development are interrelated, and that you cannot focus only on security and not talk about development. Because if peace and development provide greater opportunities for development, security is also an enabler for development. So if you are talking of a holistic development, then it is important that we as an academic group, as intellectuals, focus our attention not just on peace and development, but also on security issues too. So you cannot divert our attention from security. That's what I'm saying, that we have to focus both on security, and because security and development are two sides of the same coin. So it's very important that the world and India and Africa in particular focus on these two issues together. So this book brings in the Indian and African perspectives on issues such as development, cooperation, trade and investment. We also look at some of the security problems that both regions are facing, like terrorism, climate change. So these are some of the areas that this book delves into. It also looks at India's experience in peacekeeping. India has been present in the African continent as the provider of peace and security through the UN, under the UN banner. India has contributed. It's been one of the leading troop contributing countries under the UN peacekeeping operations. So it does discuss India's role in providing that facility or effort towards the African countries.
If you talk about security, we in India, we are aware about that our security threats come from our neighbors, Pakistan and China. What is the threat for Africa as a continent? What kind of threats do they see?
First, you have to understand what is security about. How do you look at security? So one of the chapters in the book also discusses that, that there is a changing perception about security. Security is not just limited to state-centric security, which is the realist kind of perception that that the realist school had talked about, that the only security threats could come through external factors. So this view of security, this narrow perspective of security, has changed now and moved away to a perspective which includes economic development and political issues, as also some concerns which are threatening the security. Human security is
security of citizens is what
is also an important aspect of security. So there is a broadening of the entire concept of security, how we perceive security, and that's the way the African Union and the African countries are also thinking. The African Union Charter defines security from human security angle too. So the concerns that the African countries are facing, there are various kinds of conflicts happening there. Mainly, you have conflicts, say, in countries like DRC, which has been in a state of war since the 60s, with few periods of peace, but there has been a continuous instability in that country. Several countries are facing terrorism now, and in Nigeria, which is in West Africa, you have groups like Boko Haram, which are threatening the people in the country, especially in the northern part of Nigeria. Apart from Nigeria, other parts, neighboring countries like Cameroon and Mali in Sahel are very much unstable because of the rise of terrorism in the region. The rise of terrorism is maybe due to some local grievances, but also the fact that the global jihad groups have also infiltrated these organizations. So we have splinter groups of, say, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the Islamic State, which are part of terror groups which are attacking these countries. There is this instability in West Africa. Similarly, you have a group called Al-Shabaab in East Africa, which has originated from Somalia, but it has been attacking not just the Somalis, but also countries in the neighborhood like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda. So these are the countries which have been terrorized because of the terror activities of Al-Shabaab. Similarly, in Southern Africa, Mozambique recently had an increase in terrorism is in the northern part of the country, which is very close to the sea, this region, and very close to the region where the undersea deposits of gas were discovered in the country. So what I'm trying to say is that all over Africa, you have rise of terrorism, which is one of the major security challenges. Similarly, maritime insecurity has increased. From 2008 onwards, piracy was a major threat in the Gulf of Aden region. By a few years, say in 10 years' time, the piracy in Gulf of Aden went down because of concerted action by the international community, including Indian Navy. Indian Navy has been present in the Gulf of Aden since 2008 because, maritime security is an important concern for us, and we have 90% of our trade is through the maritime route, and especially the one which is going to Europe, it passes through the Gulf of Aden. So for us, and also the fact that a large number of the mariners, the seafarers, are of Indian origin, that also made India an important partner with the African countries and the rest of international community in trying to curb the piracy in this part of the world. But unfortunately, since the end of last year, the pirates are back in the Gulf of Aden. And you must have seen the action that the Indian Navy has taken in terms of reducing piracy. That, plus the drone attacks by the Houthi rebels, has increased instability in the maritime sphere once again in the Indian Ocean or the Indo-Pacific region. But the African countries not only face the maritime insecurity in the Indian Ocean or the Indo-Pacific region, it's also on the Atlantic coast. Nigeria and the rest of the West African countries on the coastal part, which is the region which I'm talking about is the Gulf of Guinea. They've also faced large threats, maritime threats, piracy, kidnappings, and such, which has increased insecurity in the maritime sphere in this country. So these are some of the challenges which we in India also identify.
Right.
Apart from that, obviously, there are several other challenges like drug trafficking, and human trafficking. The fact that in the recent years there has been a democracy deficit in some of the countries with the unconstitutional change of power, use of military power, and increases in coups in Africa. That has also been one of the important challenges, security challenges which the African countries face.
There are a mix of internal and external conflicts.
There are mainly internal problems, but they have been enhanced because of a mix of involvement of external actors.
Because of that, you're saying is the development of the continent as a whole is slowing down, and the process of development is slowing down.
It's a big challenge for the continent to deal with this. The African countries have been trying to deal with these problems themselves. There's always a call for African solutions for African problems, but they're also looking at international partners for dealing with these issues, because finances are something which are very important. How do you finance? If you say that greater development would reduce whatever conflict that is there within the societies, that also needs a lot of money. There is a deficit of infrastructure in Africa, which is something which is very clearly identified by the African Union and the African Development Bank as a priority in terms of development priority. So they are looking at enhancing their efforts in increasing the infrastructure within the continent. They are also looking at enhancing the capacities of the people, the youth, in terms of dealing with these matters, whether it's security or enabling them to deal with various threats that they are facing. It's not just in the conventional sphere, but also in terms of cyber threats and cyber security.
So many different warfares nowadays.
Those are also the challenges. But that is not part of this book. But yeah, these are some of the issues that...
I feel India, in terms of development, is on the right track. In terms of economics, in terms of defense, in terms of different industries as well. What can Africa learn from India as a country, and how we have seen development over the past years?
So India, in the last decade or so, the Indian government in particular has been focusing on Africa a lot. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said that Africa is the high priority for India in terms of its foreign and economic policy. He's also said that India's development cooperation with African countries is driven by the African priorities. So that's the difference between India and the rest of the other countries which are engaging with Africa. What India is saying is that it is there to support the African priorities. Its relationship with Africa is built on supporting Africa in African countries in their efforts to deal with their priorities, development priorities. So the Indian government came up with 10 guiding principles of its engagement with Africa. And what are these guiding principles? These were announced by Prime Minister Modi during his visit to Uganda in 2018. He spoke at the Ugandan Parliament, where he talked about. The first two are the ones which I've already spoken about, that Africa is high priority for India in its foreign policy. Second, that India's development cooperation will be driven by the African priority.
I see.
Yeah. Third, agriculture. Agriculture is an important development objective for African countries. And similarly, for India, also agriculture is an important area of cooperation. So, agriculture is the third. Food security becomes very important, is an important concern both for India and Africa. So, that's the reason why the third guiding principle for India and Africa is that. Fourth, we are moving towards the digital world.
Right.
So it's very important that India and Africa come together and work towards enabling the youth in enhancing their capacities towards the digital sphere. So that's an important area. Then maritime cooperation, that India and, as I've said, that Africa are maritime neighbors. So that makes cooperation in the maritime sphere is equally important. Climate change is another area which links India and Africa. Both India and Africa are looking towards the world which has less carbon emissions, which is more sustainable development, more development which is cleaner development. So that is another angle of or principle which is guiding India's relationship. Then also the fact that India is aware that the multilateral sphere, both India and Africa are looking towards reforming the current multilateral order, and that these reforms are important if we need to give way to the countries in Africa taking on the high table in a number of organizations, international organizations. So these are some of the principles that are guiding India's engagement with Africa, and Africa is an important area for India's engagement with globally, and increasingly you find that there have been a number of high-level visits from India to Africa. The Prime Minister has been to Africa several times. Some of these visits have come after a gap of 20 and 30 years also. So that shows that we were neglecting Africa to some extent. There was some grievance from the African side that we don't have. While the African presidents and the leadership has been visiting India, but there weren't so many visits from India across the continent.
Right.
So I think that's been addressed now, that there is a lesser visibility deficit from the Indian leadership towards Africa. Why are these visits important? Because that gives a real time for the political elites in India, that gives an opportunity for them to assess the relationship in a real time fashion, and understand the concerns of the countries in Africa on their ground. So that definitely has an impact in enhancing the relationship, speeding up the process of growth of relationship.
This book also talks about climate change, and we are aware that Africa as a continent holds a lot of minerals that could help in transitioning into green energy as well. What is your take on that?
Yeah, Africa is very important as it is a reservoir of minerals, a large number of minerals needed for a transition towards a cleaner world are present in Africa in a big way. So if you want to develop storage cells for your mobiles, you need the metals or minerals which are available in Africa in a big way. Similarly, metals needed for building storage for solar cells are also available in some of these countries. 30% of those are available in Africa. So obviously, then these countries are important in terms of India moving away from a hydrocarbon future in terms of its energy, mix towards a more cleaner world. So Africa becomes an important partner for India in moving towards a more sustainable energy usage within our country.
Right.
So if we are moving toward that, it's right that India has been a front runner in terms of implementing policies towards renewable energy. Africa would definitely become a very important partner. African countries would become an important partner in finding solutions for all these problems within our country. As you're very well aware that that India is an energy deficit country. So we import 70% of our energy sources are from abroad. A large part of them are from the Middle East, the Gulf countries. Rest are from countries like Russia, and now Africa is also an important source of our crude oil imports. Countries like Angola, Nigeria, Algeria, and others, Egypt, are some of those which have been providing crude oil to India. Till now, we have been looking at a relationship which talked about cooperation between India and Africa in the hydrocarbon sphere. Now we are moving towards renewables with Africa. And the fact that India has been, along with France, had launched the International Solar Alliance, which called for greater cooperation in speeding up the solar energy development across the world, makes it an important factor for India and Africa to cooperate. A large number of African countries have joined up for the International Solar Alliance. Around, I think, more than 30 countries apart from Africa are part of the International Solar Alliance, because they also realize that the future, the sustainable future, is the green future, and therefore it's important. And the fact that they are within the tropics, they are the countries which have the maximum solar exposure, so that gives them the opportunity to tap that.
All in all, you see the future of Indo-Africa relation in the right direction.
Yes, I think we are moving towards the right direction. We are moving towards a direction which gives me a lot of hope for better future for both people from India and from Africa.
Like ourselves, our interest in Africa has grown over the last few years. Even China has shown a lot of interest in Africa. What do you think about that?
Yeah, China has been, its profile in Africa has been increasing in the last 2 decades. It's been phenomenal in terms of Chinese investments, its involvement in various development projects across Africa. There's no country in Africa where there is not been a visit by a Chinese delegation or investment by a Chinese concern. For the Chinese, the involvement in Africa was important due to a number of factors. One of them was that they wanted to counter the American hegemony in Africa. Secondly, they wanted to counter Taiwan, because Taiwan had built up relations with several African countries, so they were calling for a one China policy, and that was another reason. Third, resources. Resources are important. And fourth, like India, Africa is a group of 55 countries, so they are important in terms of projecting any of the Chinese policies in the multilateral sphere. So they become an important partner for projecting Chinese ambitions in the global sphere. So these are some of the reasons why China entered Africa in a big way in the last 2 decades. They set up the FOCAC, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, in 2000. And since then, there have been several meetings of this forum. The Forum Summit has been taking place regularly. The important aspect of China's relationship with Africa is that it has used the African elites, the political elites' desire for maintaining their positions with their own, the Chinese desire for resource security. So they have said that we will, that's been the policy, that we would provide you security in terms of regime security if you help us in enhancing our resource security. The development partnership has been through, as I've said, that resources have been an important aspect of the relationship. And so what they have done is that they said that resources for infrastructure, that you give us access to the resources, and we will provide you with the infrastructure. But I'm not really sure whether the infrastructure with the African countries have got from the Chinese is really something which they needed. At times, like China has built football stadium all across African countries. I'm not really sure whether these football stadiums are in use in all these African countries. And secondly, there's a big challenge which the African countries face in terms of the rising debt. Some of these countries are not able to deal with the debt, and they feel that this increasing indebtedness have really worsened the situation before the entry of China in their country. So, country like Angola is the country which has the largest debt from China, and they are, in a really bad shape economically. Some of the infrastructure, there were reports that they were not really being utilized. Chinese have built several houses which are lying vacant. Some of the hospitals which the Chinese built, they were faulty. They developed cracks, and
So do you see this like a debt trap from China?
So there is a debt trap which is emerging, which the Africans fear. While they do appreciate China as an important development partner, but the civil society within some of these countries are realizing that there is another, that there is a motive to it.
What will happen if a nation is unable to pay the debt from China?
What they fear is that they may also have to follow, or may have to face the same situation as Sri Lanka did when their port Hambantota
was taken over by
the Chinese. So China is involved in port infrastructure development all across Africa.
Even though China is trying to improve the infrastructure in a lot of African countries, what I read was, and tell me if I'm wrong, when they're trying to improve the infrastructure and improve the development of a particular sector, such as a port, for instance, they will hire all the African laborers to do the small work, and the executive role has been taken by the Chinese officers, for that matter.
So even the smaller role, the labor is also brought in from China. They bring in the Chinese prisoners for fulfilling the role of labor. In most of these countries, that has been the case. Though China has been looking at changing its pattern, it is starting to employ Africans also, but largely speaking, that's been the policy.
So it's always win-win for China.
Yeah, it is a win-win for China, though they do argue that it's a win-win both for Africa and China. For Africa, it is a win. That's what the Chinese argue, that they are getting some development is happening in the country, which the Europeans have been promising, the traditional donors have been promising, and not fulfilling. That's leading to its own kind of problems.
I think the thing with Africa is that their perception against the European countries, because they were colonized by them. One such country is France, who left a lot of African colonies in around 1960s. But even then, they somehow have economic and government control over some countries in Africa. Do you want to put some light on that, ma'am?
Yeah, so among the Francophone countries, some of these countries are still part of the Franc zone, or the CFA as it's called. France has a long historical relationship with African countries, but it was always seen as something which is exploitative by the Africans, which was always in favor of France, because the African countries were definitely exploited by French colonial rulers, and that continued till now, even while they are part of the Francophone zone. And it's not just the economic aspect of it. France has an important and extensive security presence in a large number of these countries. But in the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a lot of counter-perception towards France's policies towards some of these countries, like countries in the Sahel, have shown their disgruntlement towards the French policies. The fact that despite the presence of the French troops in these countries, the security situation in these countries have not improved. So they have like countries like Mali and last year Niger. They have asked French troops to exit from these countries. There have been chants of France go home, French go home in the streets of some of these countries,
Right.
which shows that there is a new view which is emerging in Africa, which is definitely not pro France. They feel that it's been a long time that the France has been present there, both economically and security, but both the economic condition and the security situation in these countries have not improved. So they are very unhappy with
Right.
France's relations with these countries, and that's the reason why some of these countries, especially those countries where there have been military coups in the recent years, 4 or 5 of them, the perception is totally anti-French, anti-Europe, anti-West, you can say.
Right.
So there is a change happening. There is a new view emerging in some of the African countries, which is against West.
That is not good news for France, because I was reading about 70% of the resources and finances come from these African countries. And if they are asked to leave, the control that they have right now will go away as well. Speaking of which, Russia has a role in countering France as well in these regions.
Yeah, so it's really amazing that, in some of these countries, like in Mali, the Malian authorities asked French to exit, and they invited the Russians in.
Which are doing the same job as
doing
French.
the same job, but I'm not really sure whether they've been changes in the security situation is still, the same. I think instability still prevails within these countries. Wagner Group
Right.
has been present in Mali for the last 2 years now. They also made a move in Mozambique, but not successful in curtailing terrorism over there. So they are present in several other countries. They are present in Central African Republic. Russia sees Africa as an important partner. A large number of African countries were dependent on Africa for food. The large number of countries were importing their grains, the food grains from Africa. So the recent Russian-Ukrainian conflict has had an impact on the food security of African countries. So therefore, you find that a number of African countries are looking at Russia, renewing their relationship with Russia afresh. So that is, you cannot say that they are moving away from France or the other Western countries and moving into building greater ties with Russia. They're also exercising their option to build plurality in terms of external partners.
Right.
Exercising their autonomy in terms of building relations with different partners.
Wow. So there's so much about Africa that I learned today, and this conversation has been so insightful for me, and I'm sure has been for the audience as well. I would urge the audience to read your edited book to gain more perspective in the India-Africa relations. But before we go, I would like to ask you two very personal questions that I ask all my guests. First question is, what is one piece of advice would you give to a younger self, a young researcher who was researching about the Africa and India relations?
I wish that I had more time. I spent more time in these countries. I have definitely visited about 20 of these countries in Africa, but I haven't spent as much time in each of these countries. I would like to live more in Africa to get a better perspective about the various challenges and issues that people in these countries are facing.
That's when you get a real perspective as well, by meeting Africans and asking them their perspective and the things that are happening around them. Wonderful. Last question for the day today is about any particular book that you wish you would have read earlier in your life. Could be in the space of international relations or anything for life as well.
I can't pinpoint a single book, I think, but there are a number of books. I would love to read more books about, especially since I am working on Africa, some of the biographies of the African leaders. Some of them are not available in India. in India. Maybe, if I had read them, that would have changed my perspective at an earlier date about how to deal with our relationship, how to help towards greater understanding, providing greater understanding between the civil society in India and Africa, building up people-to-people relations between India and Africa. I think that is one thing which is important, that we get the views from the people on which we are working. So I think this is one thing that I feel that I should have done. Yeah.
Thank you again, ma'am, for your time today. Really appreciated this conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed the episode or got some value out of it, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Until then, keep reimagining yourself and know that the power of change lies within you.